Hello everyone and welcome back to Mrs. B History. Today we're continuing our Cold War series and we're looking at two of the most significant turning points of the entire period, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan of 1947. By the end of this video you'll be able to explain what the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan were, why Truman felt he had to act, what they said and the terms, and crucially for your exam, what their consequences were for East-West relations. So let's begin. To understand the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, we first need to picture the world in early 1947. The Second World War had ended less than 2 years earlier, and Europe was absolutely exhausted. Cities were in ruins, economies were shattered, and millions of people were living in poverty and uncertainty. Now this is exactly the kind of situation the Soviet Union could take advantage of. Stalin had already established Soviet-controlled governments across Eastern Europe, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, as you can see in the map, and the Americans were deeply alarmed. They feared that poor, desperate, war-weary populations in Western Europe might turn to communism for answers. And then, two crises in two specific countries brought things to a head. These countries were Greece and Turkey. So let's look quickly at Greece first. Since 1946, Greece had been caught in a brutal civil war between the Greek government, which was supported by Britain, and communist guerrillas who were being backed by Yugoslavia and indirectly by the Soviet Union. Britain had been the main power holding the line against communist expansion in the region, but in February 1947, the British government sent a note to Washington that effectively said, "We can't do this anymore." Britain was broke. It simply didn't have the money or the military capacity to continue to support Greece. It was withdrawing its forces. Turkey was facing similar pressure. The Soviet Union was pushing for control over the Turkish Straits, which was a vital waterway, and Turkey needed support to resist Soviet demands. For Truman, this was a moment of crisis. If Greece fell to communism and Turkey followed, what would stop the spread continuing further into the Middle East and beyond? This thinking that communism spreads from one country to the next is what we call the domino theory, and it was central to American foreign policy thinking at this time. On the 12th of March 1947, President Harry Truman stood before the United States Congress and delivered one of the most important speeches in modern history. He asked Congress to approve $400 million in military and economic aid to be sent to Greece and Turkey. But this wasn't just about these two countries. Truman was making a much bigger, much bolder statement. He argued that the United States had a responsibility, in fact, a duty to support free people who were resisting being taken over by armed minorities or outside pressures. In other words, America was saying, wherever communism threatens to take over a country against the will of its people, we will step in. Truman didn't name the Soviet Union directly in his speech, but everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. Congress approved the aid, and the Truman Doctrine was now official American foreign policy. So let's break down the key principles of the Truman Doctrine because this is important for your Cold War exam. First, the world was divided into two ways of life. The American way, which was based on freedom, democracy and free elections, and the Soviet way, which was based on terror, oppression and the crushing of individual freedoms. Truman made this a moral argument and not just a political one. Secondly, the United States would provide political, military and economic support to any nation threatened by communist takeover. This was a massive shift in American foreign policy. Before the Second World War, America had followed a policy of isolationism, which meant staying out of other countries' affairs, whereas the Truman Doctrine was the complete opposite of that. Thirdly, this was an open-ended commitment. Truman wasn't just helping Greece and Turkey, he was telling the whole world that America was now the defender of the free world, anywhere, anytime. This policy became known as containment, basically the idea that while America couldn't roll back communism where it already existed, it could contain it and stop it from spreading further. Now, Truman and his advisers knew that political speeches alone wouldn't stop communism from spreading. Cities across Europe had been reduced to rubble. Infrastructure, roads, railways, bridges and factories had been obliterated. Millions of people were homeless, hungry and unemployed. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was one of the harshest in living memory, making food and fuel shortages even more severe. In some parts of Europe, people were literally starving. The crucial question American policymakers were asking themselves was, what happens to desperate, hungry and unemployed people? History suggested that they looked for radical solutions, and in 1947 a radical solution was available: communism. Communist parties were already growing rapidly in France and Italy, where some workers believed capitalism had failed them. This was alarming. America had spent years fighting fascism. They didn't want to do the same with communism. Poverty and desperation were communism's greatest recruiters. If people were hungry and unemployed, they might vote for or even join communist movements. So just a few months later, on the 5th of June 1947, US Secretary of State George Marshall gave a speech at Harvard University that would reshape the Western world. He argued that the USA had a responsibility to help restore the economies of war-devastated nations, framing it in humanitarian terms. He said that economic instability was a threat to democracy. He invited European nations to come together, assess their needs and draw up a plan which America would fund. This was incredibly radical, going from isolationist to supporting Europe. The Marshall Plan, officially called the European Recovery Programme, ran from 1948 to 1952, providing about $13 billion worth to aid Western European nations, which would be about $100 billion in today's money. 16 Western European nations accepted, including Britain, France, West Germany, Italy and the Netherlands. The money rebuilt factories, restored agricultural production, modernised infrastructure, stabilised currencies. Results were remarkable. Industrial production across Western Europe rose around 35% during Marshall Plan years. Economies on their knees in 1947 were growing by 1950. West Germany became one of the fastest growing economies in the world, the German economic miracle. The first motive America had was to stop the spread of communism, and this was the main driver. They believed that economic aid was almost an anti-communist vaccine. Truman said that the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan were two halves of the same walnut. A second motive was to create markets for American goods. American businesses needed export markets to maintain their post-war boom, so rebuilding Europe was good politics and good economics. A third motive was keeping Western Europe within America's spheres of influence. Nations that depended on American aid were nations that were tied to the American Western Bloc. So whilst the Marshall Plan was beneficial, understanding American motives helps you to be able to write more sophisticated analytical exam answers. The Marshall Plan was offered to all European countries. Even the Soviet Union was invited to join, but they refused. Stalin believed it was an attempt by the USA to control European economies. He thought that nations who accepted the Marshall Plan would become economically dependent on America and therefore politically loyal to them. In his view, it was an aggressive move which would allow America the right to interfere in the affairs of any country in the world as long as it could claim communism was a threat. Stalin stopped countries in Eastern Europe like Poland and Czechoslovakia from accepting Marshall aid, but was worried that he would lose his grip on Eastern Europe. Stalin dismissed America's plan as dollar imperialism, an attempt by America to buy political influence. In response, Stalin set up Cominform in September 1947, which was the Communist Information Bureau. This was essentially a Soviet-controlled organisation which was designed to coordinate and tighten Moscow's grips on communist parties across Europe. He did this as a way to make sure that Eastern European governments stayed loyal to the Soviet Union. He also set up Comecon in 1949, which was the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, as a direct Soviet alternative to the Marshall Plan. This effectively tied Eastern European economies firmly to Moscow. So what we can see here is a clear pattern. Every American action provoked a Soviet reaction. and every Soviet reaction increased American suspicion. The Cold War was rapidly deepening. The Marshall Plan and Stalin's rejection of it had a profound impact on the shape of Europe, which lasted over 4 decades. Powered by American money from the Marshall Plan, Western Europe recovered rapidly and went on to build some of the most prosperous economies in the world. The success of countries like Western Germany, France and Britain in the 1950s and beyond was powerful evidence that capitalism and democracy could deliver genuine improvements in people's lives. Eastern Europe, cut off from the aid and locked into the Soviet system, recovered more slowly. Communism tied Eastern Bloc countries to Soviet priorities rather than allowing them to develop freely. Standards of living in Eastern Europe lagged significantly behind the West, and ordinary people knew it. This contrast was a powerful propaganda weapon for the USA during the Cold War. The West pointed to its prosperity to show that freedom worked. The East struggled to counter the argument. The economic division of Europe ran almost exactly along the same lines as the political and ideological division, and the Marshall Plan was a major reason for why. One of the biggest consequences of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan was the relationship between East and West, and division of Europe into 2 sides. Western Europe was supported by the USA and capitalism. Eastern Europe was controlled by the USSR and communism. They confirmed the division of the world into 2 opposing blocs. Truman's speech announcing the Truman Doctrine made it official that there were now 2 sides, 2 systems, and 2 visions for the world's future. Any pretense of wartime cooperation between the superpowers was gone. As a result, it dramatically increased tension and suspicion. Stalin now believed, with some justification, that America was using the language of freedom and democracy to justify interfering anywhere in the world where Soviet influence was growing. This made meaningful diplomacy between the 2 superpowers almost impossible. It began a pattern of confrontation that would define the next 4 decades. American containment policy led directly to involvement in Korea in the 1950s and Vietnam in the 1960s, and countless other Cold War flashpoints. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan were the template for all of this. They helped to accelerate the arms race. As America and the Soviet Union became increasingly hostile, both sides began to invest more heavily in their military, including nuclear weapons. As a result, the world became a more dangerous place. So let's make sure you actually use this in your exam. Here are some key things to remember. For a question asking you to explain the importance of the Truman Doctrine or the Marshall Plan, you want to show how it changed things. Don't just describe what it was. Link it to increased tension, the division of Europe, or the pattern of the Cold War, and how confrontation was established. Make sure you use precise details. For example, the date of March 1947, the $400 million in aid, the concept of containment for the Truman Doctrine, or the $13 billion of aid to Western Europe, the rebuilding of economies, tying Western Europeans to the USA with trade links and deals. And remember also to be balanced. Yes, it dramatically worsened relations and it confirmed the ideological divide, but remember that relations were already deteriorating before 1947. Think about the disagreements at Potsdam, Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe, and Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in March 1946. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plans deepened the Cold War, but they didn't create it. So that's it for the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. If you found this video helpful, please give the video a like and subscribe to Mrs. B History for more GCSE history revision content.